Welcome everyone to another episode of Your Friendly Physicist and Other Nerds, your science podcast that is all about current science news, emerging technologies, scientific trends, and career advices or potential career perspectives for young scientists. Today's guest is Panashe from the British startup ViridiCO2. Panashe studied chemistry at Keele University in UK and moved then to Southampton for a PhD. And since October 2021, he is now a senior development chemist at ViridiCO2. And as the name already suggests, this episode will be about CO2. And in more detail, it will be about carbon capturing and especially how CO2 as a small molecule can be transformed into something useful like a polymer or surfactant. Because this is exactly what ViridiCO2 is doing. This company develops a catalyst that takes CO2 and turns it into something useful. And I'm really looking forward to discuss all this with Panashe. So let's tune in to hear him telling us about how small molecules like his catalysts can make quite some step forward into a greener and more sustainable future. So welcome Panashe to the show. I'm very happy that we can talk today.
Thank you very much.
So you're a scientist. You studied chemistry at the Keele University in the UK, and then you moved to Southampton for a PhD, also in the field of chemistry. Since now, roughly 2.5 years, or is it by now 3 years?
We started in October 2021, so yeah.
So since then, you are working as a senior development chemist at ViridiCO2. We can still call it a startup, right? It's still a relatively small company. So it's a startup in the UK, and I want to highlight the name because I'm still amazed. So ViridiCO2 comes from ViridiCO, which is Latin for becoming green.
Yeah. And
Okay,
also Latin for green, I believe, is viridis as well.
Viridis, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot going on there with
Yeah.
the name. Yeah.
So becoming green and the pun with ViridiCO2. So
Yeah.
it's about CO2. And this is the topic of today's episode. As a first question, what exactly is ViridiCO2? What are you guys doing?
The company itself spun out from the University of Southampton. It was the work that was done during the PhD projects of our CEO and co-founder. His name is Dr. Daniel Stewart. He was doing this work during his PhD, trying to find ways to make materials from carbon dioxide. He was able to find a catalyst platform that not only did this very well, but when he engineered it, it started to do this process much better than the materials that were existing before that. So it took it from a fairly normal process to an industrially viable process during the course of his PhD. It developed this platform quite extensively. Based off of the back of that and the commercial viability that it seems to have, he and our PhD professor at the time decided to spin it out as a company. And we've been operating out of the university labs because it's a familiar environment and we're quite, welcome there. Hopefully we don't overstay our welcome. But the university has been very accommodating. So we've continued to work out of there. It started off as three of us. Dan, he was part of the technical team at the very beginnings. Another senior development chemist, his name is Josh, and myself. It was the three of us on day one, and we just went from there. We obviously had the board members and angel investors, but in the lab, it was just the three of us to start with.
Cool. That's amazing. Congratulations to this big success. It reminds me of the podcast episode I just released before we record now this session, which was with the director of the TUM Venture Lab in Munich. And we talked a lot about infrastructure and support and networks for young scientists that want to take a scientific idea, just like you, from the lab to an industrial scale, what this actually takes. And it's great that also in Southampton, apparently you found a great support network at the university.
Yes, the university has a startup accelerator / incubator. I'm not sure what the difference is, but it's called Future Worlds, and they're very supportive of founders. They encourage entrepreneurship out of the scientific departments at the university, and they offered a great amount, continue to offer a great amount of support. So it's a buzzing environment if you're an
Cool.
entrepreneur. They really encourage people. They put people in touch with
Mhm.
sources of funding, especially angel investors. A lot of the angel investors that we were able to secure were actually introduced via Future World's links. They really do quite a lot. And, of course, the university itself, as a research intense university, it's quite geared for that sort of work as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is the environment where you would look for ideas that will solve problems in the future in the first place, right?
My experience is more around people who, came out of future worlds,
Hmm.
and with it being based at the university,
Hmm.
there's an overrepresentation of people there who spun out from their PhD projects or something similar. Overall, I think that in the UK, most small businesses don't start from, startups. At least not in the conventional way that they understood, how people think of tech startups.
Hmm.
For that sort of thing, it tends, I think, not to be necessarily coming off of a PhD project,
Okay.
but it's certainly something that I've come across quite a bit. But I think that there is a slight overrepresentation because of the environment that I
Yeah.
find myself in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. How was your experience from, let's say, okay, we are here in a lab environment, everything
Mm.
is quite at the forefront of science, and now we have to scale it up and bring it at an industrial scale.
Yeah, I would say that so far it's still underway, that sort of transition, because what I trained for during my PhD was how to synthesize heterogeneous catalysts. And this is more on a lab scale. So, doing research type studies and doing things in an environment that's more geared for that.
Hmm.
But now, as we sort of begin to scale the technology that's pre-existing, we're faced with challenges, at least in the aspect of addressing the industrial scale. We're faced with challenges that more mirror, engineering processes because we have the fundamentals. We just need that technology to be scaled. But that's also somewhat removed from what I really tinkered with during my PhD, which was the actual development of catalysts.
Hmm.
So it's still quite a learning process because we have to do new things all the time. For me, because I'm more hands-on with the scale up, it's, I think, more removed. We do still have a branch of the Catalyst team that is focused on continuing to innovate on the Catalyst side
Hmm.
because we have a working technology with a family of catalysts, and we're always trying to optimize each of the members of that family and
Hmm.
to develop new
Yeah.
branches of catalysts. But with the one that we are championing at the moment, getting it to be on industrial scale does require quite a bit more maneuvering than what we might have been familiar with at the lab scale when our PhDs were just coming to an end. But it's very promising because so far, when we've been asked for catalyst samples that represent, quite a large sample for somebody who's working in a research lab, for us, we've just thought, oh, okay, well, we'll just knock that out in a couple of days and send it over. So it's it's taken a while to get to that point, but it's quite satisfying to know that we
Hmm.
are actually scaling. Every time we look back and think, oh, we've generated this much catalyst. It's the kind of sort of amounts that if we were to be told during our PhDs that you'd be generating this amount of catalyst every month,
Yeah,
we'd
yeah,
be
yeah.
quite shocked. But now we just knock it out and send it over.
It's cool that you're still like super happy when you see the amount of catalyst you have produced and you say, "Yay, nice." That's
Yeah,
cool.
absolutely. And just in the grand scheme of things too, it's nice that we're always forward facing, but on a more individual level,
Hmm.
it's not easy to just not think back to, where we came from. Oh, this is how things used to be, and this is how they are now. And you really see the uh, the progress,
Yeah,
which is quite nice. It's fantastic.
adventurous as well.
Mm,
uh, Hearing the different challenges. I mean, developing new catalysts, I think is still quite fundamental.
mm,
Still lab scale, I would say.
Mm.
But then also having the other challenges of upscaling the champion catalyst and the working catalyst seems like a big playground for you guys.
Yeah, it really is.
So now you have your catalysts that you develop and you upscale them, which can make polymers from CO2, right?
Yeah, yeah. So on the application side, we have the potential to not just make polymers, but also surfactants. That's more what we're focusing on now. So we can make polymers,
One
and
one question in between, what is the difference between polymers and a surfactant?
on a more top level, this is the kind of question that would be better handled by the people in the applications team. But on a more general level, if you think of, say, the foams that are in the chairs that you and I are sitting on,
Mhm.
that would be a polymer. And if you think of the foaming agents in detergents, that would be a surfactant.
Okay.
So fundamentally, the properties that you have in reality are altered by whether or not it's a polymer or a surfactant. And which the type you want will depend on the type of industry you're trying to address.
Mhm.
We found that trying to target surfactants works better for some of the manufacturers who are trying to utilize our technology. If that's what they want, that's what we'll focus on
Mhm.
because we're a startup and we just serve the corner of the market that is advantageous to us and also where we can make the most impact. Because fundamentally, this is about trying to get the manufacturing industry to churn along without emitting as much CO2. So
Yeah,
trying to pull the chemical industry itself more towards carbon neutrality.
yeah, and this is what your name actually stands for. I want to make the, let's say, chemical industry greener. And now your company comes with a twist. You have these catalysts which make polymers or surfactants, whatever the market needs, out of CO2 that is emitted during the production process of these products, polymers or surfactants, right?
Generally speaking, the we're aiming to have as a more final and more completed picture. We're aiming to make it so that carbon dioxide doesn't have to be emitted into the atmosphere at all, because it can just be captured and used in the manufacture of high value products. At the moment, most chemical manufacturing plants have their own power plants on site. So in this example, we would aim to say whatever processes that are happening on site, we aim to capture the carbon that comes out of those and use it in the manufacture of other high value products. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same. So it doesn't have to be a properly closed
Okay.
cycle. So whatever processes are being powered on site, the carbon that is produced from that can be captured and put into the manufacturing process. This is something where you can essentially apply this to any sites where carbon dioxide is emitted. So there is the option not just to capture and use carbon dioxide at the same place. It can be captured and transferred somewhere else where they have the capacity to utilize it in these processes.
Okay.
But the ultimate aim would be for a very tightly closed loop where it comes out of an exhaust straight into a process. But that's not the only way to utilize it. We've even tested direct air capture carbon dioxide in our process. So even the direct air capture companies where they just capture it. The sample we had was captured from a typical, large population city,
Hmm.
and we were able to utilize that in our process. So any carbon that's captured so far from what we've seen has the potential to be used in these processes, regardless of how it's captured.
So it doesn't make a difference if it is a relatively low concentration from direct air capturing, or if it's a super high concentration, if, for example, if you take carbon out of a pipe or something.
So what we've tested so far was using more conventional capture methods where whatever the normal conventional process is,
Hmm.
is what we had. But to answer the concentration question, it did have to be concentrated. So we had to have well, normally it's about 400 ppm.
Hmm.
It had to come closer to 90 something percent for us to be able to use it
Okay.
for the kinetics of the reaction.
Okay.
Yeah, so the sort of concentration aspect, I think that is where the capture technology is so useful because it does enable other people to do that. We've spoken with some players in the industry who are already in talks with people who do this. They just need the technology to use
Hmm.
the carbon that's captured. So as the capacity to capture increases,
Yeah.
the ability to utilize then is going to be much more pressing. And that's where we hope to plug ourselves into
So
this.
great. I mean, I looked up the numbers, which are quite shocking, actually. It's 51 billion tons of greenhouse emissions, from which 80% is carbon dioxide. There are these carbon neutrality contracts that are signed by the industry nations, which is basically saying carbon net zero by 2050, I think.
Yes.
And in order to achieve this, I think the industry has to change the way it produces their products or implementing, for example, technology that you're providing. Do you have any idea how much CO2 you have prevented from going into the atmosphere?
With us still operating at the smaller scale,
Mhm.
we've not been able to really impact the market to the extent that we want to. So far, because we've only done projects where we are trying to establish the technology with the pre-existing infrastructure, we're fairly limited in being able to properly address the market. So the market players that we've spoken with, they aim to replace 30% by mass of their fossil fuel derived materials with CO2. So as a raw material kind of estimate, that's where we would be aiming to get to, just in terms of how much in tonnage we're replacing the fossil derived products, and we'd be getting that from capture. So if we look at the amount that the industry itself utilizes in fossil fuel derived materials, 30% of it would be replaced by CO2.
It's a win-win-win situation, basically. I mean, you as a startup win if you get the contracts with these companies. The environment wins because less CO2 is emitted to the atmosphere, but also your clients win basically because these 30% waste CO2 basically comes for free. I mean, not for free because they have to pay you and the catalyst, but
Mm.
in the end, it's probably cheaper than the conventional fossil fuel derived products, right?
Yeah, and this is just in an example where we are aiming for a
Hmm.
30%. We can replace up to 50%. So the way that the technology works is that you still need some of the fossil fuel derived material. If you don't want to do that, you then have to have some hydrogen present in order to carry out the reaction. That is not the way our technology works. So we can replace up to 50%. But
Okay.
30% is a case study. Like you said, it would definitely be more advantageous to replace the more premium raw material with what is considered a waste raw material. Of course, like you said, there will be some cost to it because of the way that it's happening.
Yeah.
But it's a win for the end user as well. If you look at the surfactants market, it's one of those things that everybody utilizes. Anytime somebody goes into the shower, anytime they wash their hands, they're using surfactants. If 30% of all the detergents we use, if 30% by mass were made from waste CO2, for example, that would be quite an agreeable idea to the average person who goes into a shop to buy something. If it is literally reducing the carbon dioxide that is present in the atmosphere by making that product, it's also a win for them. Everybody worries about CO2 emissions now. It's not something that's more niche anymore. It's at the forefront of everyone's mind. We've been told, like you said before, about the 2050 targets. For people who are working today, like you and I, we've fairly recently, entered the working life proper. But 2050 is going to be before you and I retire.
Yeah.
So it's something that a lot of people are aware of, especially in the younger generation, because it's a greater proximity to that target that we have than perhaps other generations might.
Do you sense this or do you experience this when you reach out to acquire new customers and then there is a company which is run by, let's say, an older generation?
I think that overall, when you look at companies, they have a good idea of how their final, or the final user, the end user of their product perceives their products. They
Mm.
have a good idea of how they want their product to be perceived as well. I would say that regardless of the sort of demographic of these companies, there is interest. If not for any other reason, it's because the people that they need to market to, they worry about it. The people that they're ultimately trying to get to buy their products, this is something that they worry about, and this is something that they would be willing to pay more for.
Mhm.
So for these
Mhm.
companies, regardless of how their perspectives are, or how the individuals within the companies and how their perspective are regarding the CO2 emissions issue,
Yeah. Yeah.
there is something for them to gain just from knowing what their customers need.
Yeah, I
And
see.
of course, that's to say nothing of what we spoke about before with the potential savings that are there as well, just the savings of utilizing this technology.
Yeah.
It's now not a point of just how people view the issue from a personal perspective. There is now a practical case to be made for it as well, and we're trying to establish that practical case. And so there are many reasons to view things that way.
Probably one of the main reasons is in the end saving money. But regardless, the motivation, if you as a company can install your technology at these companies,
Mm.
then it's a win for everyone.
We would prefer for it to be for the right reason,
Yeah.
which is we just need a more stable world.
Yeah.
But, if the reasons that people do it don't necessarily align with that, it's still going to get done. If our company has a fairly young technical, the average age for the technical team is in the 20s. So for us, we're kind of working because 2050 is crunch time. But we understand that perhaps there are people who don't think the same way, but we need to get them to do something anyway. Whichever way we get them to do it is okay with us.
So you would say it's a bigger challenge than, let's say, the technical details of new catalysts, upscaling, etc.
Selling the technology, selling
Yeah.
the idea of the technology.
Yeah.
Selling the idea of the technology, I would say, is it's a relatively straightforward process. If you're speaking with people who are less technically aware of the technology, you can explain it from any of the other perspectives that you and I have discussed.
Hmm.
If it's something that you can explain from the perspective of wanting to remediate CO2 emissions from the environment, that is one side that you can take. The other side that you can take is that it's fundamentally interesting technology anyway. One other side you can take as well is obviously the cost saving aspect, which when you're trying to sell this idea, if nothing else is going to resonate with people, there is not a person on this planet who's not willing to save money on something. I mean, some people care about it less than others, but if something is going to cost a bit less, then you can always get somebody interested that way. But selling the idea is I would say it's not too complicated because people want these solutions. It's not that people are building walls in the way. It's just that in the past, the kind of technology that has come to the market with the work we've been doing, it's not been as accessible. It's like anything else. If you look at any other technologies that have emerged in the past couple of few decades, there is always that period of time where you're paying a premium for it. And then as more research is done, you start to find technical milestones where each of these milestones makes the process more accessible.
Mhm.
And I think that we've brought one of those steps into the fold. So the conversation is simplified by having these kind of technologies like the one that we're bringing.
Yeah, makes sense. Still, I'm wondering, in your answer, you also said it's of fundamental interest developing a catalyst that can make polymers, which means long molecules out of CO2, which is a very small molecule. Is this really something that is fundamentally new or coming up in the last couple of years?
So the inorganic side, generally speaking, would be the catalyst
Mm-hmm.
side. There are various catalysts that have existed in the literature for decades. It's just that, like I was saying before, the technical challenges that exist to make these possible has kept them to a certain extent as an academic interest. Oh, this is technically possible. We could do it.
Mm-hmm.
But doing it at the scale that is required to supply a chemical industry would be somewhat prohibitive. So even though the fundamental technology itself
Yeah. Okay.
has been around for decades, the nature of the conditions that are required and the nature of the catalysts that are used, it's um it's made it less desirable to run on an industrial scale.
Mm-hmm.
But then as new ways of doing it start to emerge, you start to find that out, perhaps it's becoming much more accessible than it
Yeah.
used to be. It's a hot topic, so
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll find that there will be multiple people trying to do the same thing. But when it comes to our platform in particular, I've not seen anything that really does things the same way.
So I was just thinking maybe it's a good time now to explore catalysis and how a catalyst actually works in a bit more detail. So we didn't have a nerd talk for quite some time now on this show, and yeah, totally would be up for it. So I just play the jingle and then we can start. Nerd talk. A catalyst is, let's say, a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction without itself being consumed or undergoing any permanent chemical changes. And now I want to know from you, what is the specialty of the ViridiCO2 catalyst or the catalyst family and your catalytic reaction?
Generally speaking, if you look at catalysis reactions, you have homogeneous reactions and you have heterogeneous reactions, where in the homogeneous case, your catalyst is in the same physical phase as your reactants. So think of a liquid and a liquid together. When you have a system like that, when your reaction is done, your catalyst is stuck in your product.
Yeah.
You then have to remove it somehow, and removing a liquid from a liquid is a fairly expensive process. That's not something that multiple people would be willing to do when it comes to industry scale. However, if you have a catalyst that's in the solid phase and your product is a liquid, it's much easier to then remove your catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
That makes the process much more attractive. The same can be said, or some along the same lines. You can consider that if you have a catalyst system where you have particularly harmful elements, actual periodic table elements in the catalyst, the option to leave it in your product is not even there. So,
Yeah.
in the liquid and liquid case, if the catalyst isn't going to do anything, you have a case to say, oh well, it's done its job, so we can leave it in there. Some people might be willing to do that, but if you have, for example, certain metals in there that are not compatible with human biology,
Yeah.
you don't have that option, so you must do
Yeah.
the separation. And so the sort of toxicity side of things and the separation side of things, those together, they often present an obstacle for people who are trying to use catalysts. There are cases where it doesn't matter, but in our case, we do address that. So it's a solid, it's a white powder. It's not some, luminescent green or something like that. That it's
Okay.
quite so it offers both options. It's also got no components that are known to be
Mm-hmm.
worrisome when it comes to people hand. So those little things that can be lost in the details sometimes until you have conversations like this, they offer huge advantages for somebody who is considering using this sort of technology.
Cool. That was a perfect nerd talk. There wasn't a nerd talk for a couple of episodes now. It's nice.
Oh, I'm glad we ticked the box.
Yeah, I can even continue the nerd talk because this was my very first publication separating a biocatalyst from a liquid. It was an enzyme, horseradish peroxidase,
Mm,
HRP, and we immobilized it on gold nanoparticles. And then we could centrifuge the liquid and we could take enzymes immobilized on the gold nanoparticles
yeah.
from the bottom of our tube, and then we
Hmm.
could reuse it.
Okay.
That was my master thesis, my
Well, that's
bachelor.
fantastic.
Yeah, that was super nice.
So to reuse it, I guess you had to remove it from the horseradish peroxidase that's stuck on the nanoparticles. How then do you remove it?
No, no, it was still catalytically active while sitting on the gold nanoparticles.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it starts the reaction already attached to the
Yeah,
nanoparticles. Okay, I
yeah,
see. So I guess the active site didn't bind to the nanoparticles. You'd use
no,
a different group to bind to the
yeah,
nanoparticles, and then another group was doing the reaction.
yeah.
Very
HRP is
interesting.
HRP is great because it has some sulfur containing
Mm,
groups, and sulfur and gold is very strong
yeah.
binding, and
Once it's on there, it's on there.
yeah, and the catalytically active site is the Hem group, and this
Mm,
apparently was unaltered during the immobilization process, and we
okay.
was a case study, proof of principle. We reused it 3 times and it worked like a charm.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
See, those are the kind of workarounds that you have
yeah,
when you have the homogeneous catalysis.
yeah.
We had a similar thing in the group that I did my PhD in, where previous members had something very similar, where they had a biologically active molecule and they wanted to use catalysis for it, and then they stuck it onto silica. So,
Hmm.
similar thing, but
Yeah.
trying to stick things onto silica, you do need more specialized groups than the type of bond that you make with gold. But
Hmm.
I guess with putting sulfur on metal, it's a one-way trip. It really
Hmm.
is. And that's part of how most catalysts get deactivated. They get covered with sulfur,
Oh,
and it's
really?
very difficult to remove. Yeah. Um, once you get sulfur on your catalyst, it's game over.
So you really have to check that your process is very clean, like isolated from impurities from the outside, right?
Oh, no, not for this system.
Okay,
So I'm
okay.
talking more in general because my
Yeah.
PhD was in nanoparticle catalysts,
Mm.
and in that case, I had to think about it a lot more
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
the active sites are very different. They bind very differently. Sulfur and metal nanoparticles,
Yeah,
they just like each other.
yeah.
But so far we've not really had any trouble with sulfur poisoning. It's not something that we've had to worry about. And I think it's because of the nature of the process.
Okay.
Metal nanoparticles tend to be used in processes where the feedstock itself has got some sulfur compounds.
Hmm. Okay.
And
Yeah,
so,
makes sense.
yeah, and so, you have to think about it more. But with our
Okay.
process, for example, we're running at something like 70 to 80 degrees. So you don't have to worry about, it's not like a gas phase reaction, which is what you normally would have metal nanoparticles for,
Hmm.
in a lot of cases anyway. Very different type of systems where the reaction that I was doing was trying to oxidize a an alcohol to a ketone, and
Hmm.
that was happening at 200 degrees
Hmm.
in the gas phase. Very, very different type of system. It was
Fun.
two chapters of my thesis. I was trying to to do that reaction and trying to make sure those nanoparticles remained relatively okay under those conditions was interesting. It's nice to not have to worry about that now.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice that the ghosts from your research past
Yeah.
stay in the past.
Oh, good God. Yes. Phew. I was talking to one of the other development chemists actually yesterday, just sort of talking about how there are things about our PhD experience that I think you know the phrase, a calm sea never trained a skilled sailor.
Hmm. Yeah.
Once you've trained on a stormy sea, and then you sail on normal seas, things just the things seem a lot more friendly, and it
Yeah.
was kind of like that because there were things about our PhD that just presented fundamental walls, and trying to navigate them is something that we're happy we're not having to deal with now.
Yeah.
Because if it was the other way around, we would be struggling right now.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, thank you for this great nerd talk and all these insights into catalysis and catalysts. Awesome.
So coming back to ViridiCO2,
Mm.
what's ahead of this company? What are your future plans?
So fundamentally, we would like to be able to, in the near term, address the surfactant market. There are a significant proportion of chemical manufacturing makes up a significant proportion of CO2 emissions. So being able to address a large, well, a considerable part of that market
Mm-hmm.
with our
Mm-hmm.
technology, that would, bolster our goals towards being able to fundamentally reshape the carbon emissions of the manufacturing industry. But what we are thinking of at the moment is that we're still motoring on investment. So we're just sort of focused on trying to build these commercial relationships that allow us to make the case to have more investment to grow the company even further. So in the midterm, we just want to be able to establish this with multiple partners and, you know, start to use that to grow the company even further. To a certain extent, it's what you expect from a startup where things are quite busy all the time. It is nice though that we still manage to find time to do things like escape rooms and
Mm-hmm.
go-karting sometime, I think this year or last year. It's nice to have this level of busy because
Yeah.
it means that somebody wants us to help them to implement this technology. It is good that we're always onto something.
One really can feel how passionate you are about this concept and bringing this technology to life and to make a real impact.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, most
Yes.
people, when they go to work, what they want to do is to do the kind of work that makes them satisfied.
Yeah.
And for me, fundamentally, when I look at it, I'm just like, I'm okay with what I do.
Yeah. That's
That's for some people, that's a luxury, and I
cool.
definitely appreciate that. And I'm very, very, very happy to be doing it.
Cool. If you would have one advice for young scientists, what would it be?
I guess I'll give myself as an example. When I started my chemistry degree way back in the day, the idea of I guess it was just a blanket. It was everything was blanketed under sustainability. It was something that people kind of thought of as it was an afterthought for most of us in chemistry at the time. People didn't really think about it that much, and so I found myself being one of the few people who was interested in doing case studies on things like the ozone hole and how the alkali acts from way back in the day kind of started a certain trend of people worrying about how the chemical industry
Mm-hmm.
affects the general public. And for most people, they didn't really place any attention on that, but that was okay with me. It was something that interested me. It was something I wanted to know more about. And I ended up getting funneled into that sort of direction because I kept making decisions that put me in proximity with things that aligned with sustainable goals. So I ended up
Mm-hmm.
doing a catalysis project because of that. I ended up doing a flow chemistry project because of that. It's another way of affecting chemical manufacturing. So if I had kind of gotten into the same mindset that everybody had, which is just like, eh, I think I might have missed out on some of the things that I've really enjoyed now, which are
Mm-hmm.
being able to actually address the things that I personally, at the time, wanted to know more about and to impact. So overall, I think my advice would be if it's something that you're fundamentally fascinated by, it's worth finding out how deep the rabbit hole goes. Sometimes, it's eventually you have to come out again and, live in the real world. But I think that for Viridi, the timing has been in our favor. If the company had tried to do the same thing perhaps 20 years ago when this was not something that people fundamentally cared about to the same extent, it would have been perhaps a more difficult journey. But right now, I think that we've had some good fortune in that the moment we tried coming to the market was also the moment that the market was trying to look for things like this.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. But I would say that my advice would be to explore those things that really on a core level are the things that people want to interact with.
Yeah, it's basically, you could say, follow your inner nerd,
Yeah.
which is the perfect ending sentence of this episode of Your Friendly Physicist and Other Nerds.
Yes.
Yay!
Fantastic.
Great advice. Panashe, it was so fun talking to you about this fantastic technology and your transition from PhD to a startup, and in the end, follow your inner nerd. Amazing.
No.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
That's it for today. If you got any more questions for Panashe or me, then let us know in the comments. We really hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did so, share it with a friend. Thanks for tuning in, see you soon, and stay curious.